So, hello everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I love these meetings, and actually I hate meetings. But this is the one meeting that I go to. This is the third time I've been with the meaning conferences, and I love them because there's so much humanity among the people here. And I swim in different waters in the. I'm a researcher, and I'm often at conferences with very smart and talented and high-powered and competitive people, maybe a little short on humanity, and so I love being here, and I look forward to sharing with you my thoughts about forces that nurture and undermine meaningful lives. So this is the plan for my talk. I'm going to begin with some opening observations about how I think about meaning making and why I think it's such an important topic for us to be concerned about. And then under the heading of what forces nurture meaningful lives, I'm going to give a lot of emphasis to education and actually the pursuit of knowledge. And I'm going to draw attention in particular to why we need to learn about the arts and humanities, what they do for us. And then, of course, I think all people in this room are believers that experiences of adversity and challenge often nurture meaningful lives. I do a lot of research on health inequalities, and so I'm also going to spend time talking about forces that undermine meaningful lives, and here I'm going to give emphasis to unjust societies and greed as a pernicious force at the top of many societies, and give you a window on what we're learning about that in terms of research. And then I'm also going to think about prejudice and exclusion and intolerance and discrimination as other forces that undermine meaningful lives, and then end with some thoughts about what can we do in the face of the crazy world in which we currently live. So, in my view, meaning making is actually the ultimate existential task that we all have. It requires that we carefully see and feel and strive. And in that sense, I think it overcomes some problems that the discipline of psychology has created for us, where it has partitioned the human being into the cognition and emotion and motivation and personality. Meaning making requires that we work all of those pieces together. And meaning making, when it's working well, emanates from foundational values. And it's critically important that we actually think about and examine foundational values. And then I would argue that meaning making is closely linked to this eudaimonic model of psychological well-being that I've built my career around, where I draw extensively on, you can't see what's in the bottom of this figure. I'm happy to send this PowerPoint file to anybody who wants to look at it, but those are the 6 dimensions of well-being that I developed years ago by reading a lot of existential, clinical, developmental, humanistic psychology, and reading Aristotle on eudaimonia, which is about achieving the best that is within us. It's about a personal excellence, and it's become my religion. And I want to emphasize that I've spent the last 25 years basically trying to document how these aspects of eudaimonic well-being matter for people's health and how long they live. And I did that not as an end in itself. It's not like I was walking around with this driving interest in how does well-being relate to health. It was done as a means to an end, which is, if we really believe that these aspects of well-being are critically important in optimal human functioning, and they need to be taken seriously by policymakers, by people who control resources and how societies get organized, we have to assemble an evidential basis for demonstrating the power of these aspects of well-being. So that's what I've spent my time on, but that is not what I'm going to talk about today, because I talk about that too much and I need a break from talking about that. And so I'm talking about other things today. I also want to just draw attention to, there's a lot of scholarship on meaning and meaninglessness. So Emile Durkheim wrote about anomie, which is basically a kind of meaninglessness. And Durkheim believed that meaningless occurs when social systems break down and people don't have clear normative expectations for how to behave. And he believed that loss of normative guidelines is really what contributes to deviant behavior and depression and even suicide. And I think those were provocative ideas. They're an important part of the history of sociology. But I also think we need to be critical of that perspective. In our contemporary world, we have societies that are full of clearly articulated norms and well-established social structures, but they're not making for good lives for a lot of people. So you can actually have high-functioning societies defined with clear normative expectations, but they are still not working for many people in society. I also would draw attention to the fact that sociology in general, and Durkheim in particular here, ignored the individual capacity for meaning-making in the face of adversity. I have my undergraduates read this classic article written by James Dowd in 1990, published in Human Development, entitled "Ever Since Durkheim, the Socialization of Human Development." And I love the points he was making. He was basically critiquing human development theories like Erikson and Kohlberg and Freud. But basically his point was this. What we learn when we think about social structure vis-a-vis those theories of human development is that the opportunities for human development are not randomly distributed, but they disproportionately accrue to privileged segments of society. And this is a big theme of what I currently rant about. How do class inequalities affect human development? Something we should all care about. And Dowd did a beautiful job of articulating basically two pathways through which class inequality undermines the human development of some segments of society. One is through the allocation of resources that are enabling requisites of human development, and the other is through human subjectivity. Individuals need a desire to develop their own potential. So his thesis, which I think is really powerful, is that both opportunity and desire are necessary for the development of human potential. Which brings me to the first force that I think nurtures meaningful lives, which is education, the opportunity to have knowledge. It is an enabling requisite, as Dowd articulated. In the U.S., the Mellon Foundation has launched a new initiative on what's called the value and effectiveness of a liberal arts education. The liberal arts education in the U.S. is under siege now in an era of STEM education, which I'll get to in a minute. But Mellon put together 5 essays on their website, one of which was written by me that was intended to help them advance this perspective on how a liberal arts education is so important, and we need to do more to make sure that it remains a powerful force in higher education in America. In my chapter, or in my essay, which you can find on their website, or I'm happy to send it to people, I approach this question from the vantage point of, okay, I study psychological well-being. I know it's important for people's health. I know it's important for how long they live. And so I'm asking the question, what nurtures well-being? And I'm answering that I think actually a liberal education, rich in exposure to the arts and humanities, by which I mean history and philosophy and all varieties of the arts, I believe those are actually really powerful forces in nurturing people's well-being. And I went back and reviewed the history of the liberal arts education in America. And I developed ideas about this education cultivates essential sensibilities that many of us need for taking in what's beautiful in life, what can help us always appeal to our better angels. And throughout my talk, I come back to the problem of elitism in higher education. So thoughtful people in the field of education have written great books about the history of education in the United States of America. So Thomas Jefferson, who crafted most of the Declaration of Independence, was also the founder of the University of Virginia in America. It came notably after Harvard and Princeton, which were universities that were developed initially to basically train clergymen and ministers. But the University of Virginia was where the thinking about the liberal arts education first began to take off. And so Jefferson wrote in his beautiful way about useful knowledge that is capacious. Isn't that a great word? And open-ended. And that knowledge needs to be a means to improve public and private life. However, it was delightful for me to discover that Benjamin Franklin, around the same time, had some really snarky things to say about the idle students at Harvard. Their education taught them mostly how to carry themselves handsomely and enter a room genteelly. And he was very critical of inherited privilege, much of which occurs through the educational system that cements unearned advantage. Other people who are prominent in the history of American philosophy and education, like Ralph Waldo Emerson's beautiful writings about self-reliance, drew extensively on the argument for a broad education. And then we have these amazing American scholars, Black American scholars, after the Civil War, who are writing about education for the freed slaves. What should it be about? And some argue that it should be education for jobs, for trades. And W.E.B. Du Bois wrote eloquently and beautifully about that is the wrong path for thinking about educating the slaves, the freed slaves. It should be about capacity building, and that's what we learn from a liberal education. So this quote, I adore, education is for human development, human freedom, not the molding of an individual into a being who can form a particular task. Now, if we fast forward to the present era, we have new books written on education, higher education in the United States. This book was put together by members of the National Academy of Science. This is the very elite institution, mostly male, in the U.S. that sort of tells us what's important and how resources should be allocated, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out, in this era of preoccupation with stem cell education, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, medicine, in this era, the people who are out there hiring these technology-oriented young people who've been trained in STEM fields are mortified that that kind of education is not cultivating creativity, it's not cultivating problem-solving skills, and it's probably not cultivating much in the way of humanity. So this book, and the title branches from the same tree, came from Einstein, but it's basically about the need to bring more of the arts and humanities back into STEM fields. And there are just some interesting tidbits in this book. One is this quote by the conductor of the American Symphony Orchestra, who said, "There are more skilled and virtuosic musicians alive now than ever before in history, yet what is missing is not technique and expertise, but interpretation and musical expression." And additional thoughts about how music conservatories also need to be providing a much broader education. So that brings me to forces that nurture meaningful lives, the arts and humanities. A wonderful book by Harold Bloom, professor of English literature at Yale for a very long period of time. This is a fabulous book, How to Read and Why, and it starts out with these opening observations. Why do we read great literature? To strengthen the self and learn its authentic interests. How about this? To clear the mind of cant, to recover our sense of the ironic. And this is my favorite one, in quest of a mind more original than our own, to prepare ourselves for change. I don't have time to go into how he helps you really love this exquisite poem about Ulysses by Tennyson. For any of you who work in the field of aging, read this poem. It's so inspirational. Every aging person should memorize this poem. Another professor of English who is at Jefferson's University of Virginia, Mark Edmondson, has also written beautifully about nurturing human vitality through reading great literature and poetry, quoting from William Carlos Williams about men dying miserably every day for want of what is found in despised poems. And I'm making plugs for some films here along the way. If you haven't seen the film Paterson, don't miss it. Paterson is where William Carlos Williams lived. Paterson, New Jersey, working class town. He was caring for working class people and writing this incredible poetry on the side. And the film is about a bus driver in contemporary Paterson who's a poet. It's a magnificent film. Okay, so Edmondson also tells us, unfortunately, a lot of education in the humanities is not about teaching literature to nurture human vitality. It's more about teaching critical thinking, Derrida, the humanities teaching a dissociation of intellect from feeling. And he quotes, Gilles, a true education ought to fuse rather than divide heart and mind. And Goethe's observation, it's easy to be brilliant when you don't believe in anything. So then we have forces that nurture meaningful lives under the heading of adversity and challenge. And this is the area that we all are steeped in, I think, in this group, in this society. The heroic achievements of Viktor Frankl and how he accomplished what he accomplished, both by looking back and drawing on these resources from his past life, but also imagining himself in the future. As I was putting together my thoughts for this presentation, it occurred to me for the first time that it's possible that Viktor Frankl was able to do these astonishing things because he was so well educated. This is just coming back to, as a psychiatrist, he could understand the sadism of the guards. He could dig deeply into his own reflections about things, and those skills are nurtured by education. Another example of meaningful lives being nurtured by adversity is Joseph Brodsky, the Nobel Prize winning poet from Russia who nearly died of starvation during the siege of Leningrad. He goes on to suffer through his period of adversity in Russia. He then leaves the country, becomes a cause célèbre in the West, U.S. poet laureate, who has wonderful things to say about why do we need poetry. By failing to read or listen to poets, society dooms itself to inferior modes of articulation, those of the politician, the salesman, or the charlatan. And at some points in history, we have people who put all those together and throw in an element of narcissism and mendacity. Well, I'll try to stay out of that zone. But what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom is actually the gift of speech and the fact that poetry is our linguistic beacon. And then I just want to draw attention to this other example. This is, some of you may know about the art of Charlotte Solomon. The book of her art, which is a huge book, was published in 2015. She was a Jewish student at the Berlin Fine Arts Academy, had already a very difficult life before the Holocaust was unfolding around her, many suicides in her family. As a young woman, she flees to southern France, and in a period of 3 years, she paints over 1,000 watercolors using 3 primary colors. She dies at Auschwitz in 1943 when she's 5 months pregnant. And the art in the book is so incredible because it's full of narrative. So there's the art and then her words that are accompanying all of these paintings. So this is a painting of the Academy of Arts with the words, "Only he who dares can win, only he who dares can begin." And this art, you probably can't see the image very well. There's too much light up here. Yes, I've said it all along. No, she could never be happy. My wife said it all along. No, she could never be happy with that husband and that child. Yes, we've said it all along. No, she could never. And here's an image. She always had her happy sister's face before her. This is such an incredible depiction of depression, I think. I've no one left now. Fate, fate, how harsh you are. But along the way, she's learning about the Pietà. She's discovering all these other great forms of artistic expression. And just this last painting, which draws on a lot of people who, but the words are really what are powerful here. But I realized that this was not so easy. I realized that no heaven, no sun, no star could help me if I did not contribute to my own will. And then I realized that I actually still had no idea who I was. I was a corpse. And I expected life to love me now. I waited and came to this realization. What matters is not whether life loves us, but that we love life. That's so powerful. So I think these kinds of observations, and many other people think this as well, are opening new questions for science about the role of the arts and humanities in nurturing human health and well-being. And these are just some examples of how that's going on. There's a lot of literature out there about the connection between art, healing, and public health. But that brings me to the other part of my talk, forces that undermine meaningful lives, unjust societies, and greed at the top. And the historical context here is the context of ever-widening inequality. In the U.S., we have a rise in what's called deaths of despair. This is work coming out of demographers, epidemiologists who are showing more people are dying of alcoholism and drugs in midlife. And it's tied to basically their educational status, the opioid crisis. One could argue that meaning-making is under siege among disadvantaged segments of society. So in the U.S., people are writing great books about the growing class divide that exists, the top 20% versus the rest of us. Upper middle class people have privileged access to better education, jobs, stable marriages, successful partners, safe neighborhoods, higher incomes, more wealth, healthier lifestyles, and longer lives. This is a great book by Carol Graham, who basically shows that unequal lives translate to compromised levels of optimism, life satisfaction, and happiness. And then we have economists giving us windows on what's actually happening in terms of wages and corporate profit. and evidence, hard evidence, that paychecks are lagging as corporate profits are soaring. That's basically what this graph shows. And then we get to corporate America and its active role in suppressing the wages of many workers. This is called monopsony power. It's the ability of employers to suppress wages below the efficient or perfectly competitive level of compensation. Monopsony power, in my view, is a behavioral enactment of corporate greed. And then we get to people who are now fighting back against the billionaires, the radicals who are taking on the global elite. We have Rutger Bregman is the guy with the glasses from the Netherlands. He's written a book called Utopia for Realists. Winnie Bignamini is the head of Oxfam, which is fighting poverty and hunger around the world. And then there's Anand Giridharadas. He's the one I want to give attention to. Everybody needs to read this book. Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. So first he depicts, again, the context. Middle-class life is about stagnant wages, erratic hours, defanged unions, ballooning debt, non-existent sick leave, dismal schools, and predatory lending. And into this mix, we have Silicon Valley billionaires and venture capitalists, renegades playing outside of the system, market thinking, and protecting the system that is at the root of the problems they pretend to want to solve. So let me just note, for those of you who know anything about Uber, maybe you use Uber drivers. Uber has made some folks from Silicon Valley into billionaires. It's an app that's all over the world. Well, guess what? There now is a lot of evidence emerging that Uber drivers cannot make a living. And they have no unions. They have no protection. They have their connection to their phone. Okay, so what does Anand Giridharadas have to say about this? It's about philanthropy. He says today's elite are among the more socially concerned elites in history, and they are also the more predatory. The book examines how they abet an unjust status quo that protects their wealth and power while trumpeting win-win solutions. We're doing well by doing good. It's really a spectacular book. There's also a great interview. Ezra Klein, who does great audio interviews, look it up online and listen to Ezra Klein's interview with Anand Giridharadas. One example in the book is about the Sackler family, which is now getting a lot more attention in the U.S. I don't know how many of you have heard about the Sackler family. They're behind Purdue Pharma. So here we're in the middle of big pharma. Purdue Pharma created OxyContin, which is the highly addictive opioid painkiller. And the Purdue Pharma operation run by the Sackler family engaged in aggressive marketing, massive over-prescribing of this drug, which has now resulted in more than 200,000 overdose deaths in the U.S. Now, if that wasn't pernicious enough, along the way, the Sackler family created new drugs to treat the addiction they had created. I mean, incredible, incredible. Now, multiple lawsuits are unfolding about this, but the Sacklers are also famous for their philanthropy, giving big dollars to major art museums all over the world, the Louvre, the Met, and so on. And there's an amazing photograph you can find online in which people in the Guggenheim Museum in New York City are laying down on the floor of the museum to protest the money being given to the museum by the Sackler family. So this represents like something that is producing a major outcry that is having consequences. Okay, greed is not new. Sadly, greed and gluttony have always been part of the human condition, and we've got Dante's Inferno here, where we have incredible depictions of greed and gluttony and fraud and dishonesty. And even Adam Smith was concerned about greed. Yes, he was the father of self-interest and capitalism, but he wrote in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, this vain and insatiable lot do not know the limits of their own appetites. Now, this other book, Boileau, was a dissertator at Princeton who wrote a book about greed and injustice in classical Athens. And it's very interesting to learn that in that period, there was a belief that greed should be publicly censured. And I think that's true. I think greed needs to be publicly censured. The question is, how do you do it? How do you do it? And I'm now advocating that science can actually be an important mechanism for publicly censoring the consequences of greed at the top for those below. A really important question is, what lies behind this growing acceptance of inequality? And wonderful research is being done about what's called the New Gilded Age, socialization for affluence at elite institutions. The French sociologist Bourdieu wrote a long time ago about how elite schools are mechanisms that reproduce class hierarchies. Another force that undermines meaningful lives, we all probably agree on, is prejudice, exclusion, intolerance. And here I just want to draw some attention to how the arts might be able to help with these problems. Contemporary fiction, I would argue, helps us actually get inside the experience of the refugee in a way that one hopes activates some empathy and some compassion. This book by Angie Thomas, The Hate You Give, has now been made into a film. This is about, the legacy of slavery in America, racism that is still thriving in America, and how it's making family life so difficult. This one, this is a book not to be missed. This young woman just won the Penn Faulkner Award for this book, Call Me Zebra. It's about a refugee family that escapes on foot from Iran, walks to Turkey. Her life thereafter, both parents die and at various points along the way. But she comes from a family of enormous erudition and scholarship, a father who has just all kinds of stuff in his head that he is imparting to her every day. And so she is basically using great literature in the way that she's taught to use it. That you can reclaim your life through great literature. When war came, her family didn't fight. They took refuge in books. Literature is the only form of cartography. What makes the book, it's got a love story in it. I mean, it's a really fabulous book, but what makes it so incredible is how throughout the book, and I think this is why she got the award, she is actually drawing on Nietzsche and all of the rest of these folks and many more in trying to basically understand what is happening to her. And memorization of a lot of pearls from all of these writers is a key part of the book. The visual arts, I would argue, can also play an important role in dealing with prejudice and discrimination and unfair neighborhood city slums. The Porchlight program in Philadelphia is about innovation in disadvantaged neighborhoods in Philadelphia. You can learn about the program more online. This is just an example of some of the art. Some of the art is created by recovering addicts in the city. But they've done, so the art is there, it's incredible art, and people are not only doing the art, there are researchers involved who are actually studying how the public murals actually impact people's health through creating a sense of collective efficacy in the neighborhood, a sense of aesthetic quality, belongingness, responding to the forces of stigma. Okay, I'm probably over time. I'm okay? Okay, so I'm down to my finale. I raced through my slides. That's why I'm happy to send them to people, but for whatever reason, I hate going over time. Okay, so meaning making in our crazy world. This is a theme that has come up repeatedly in many presentations. How do we make meaning vis-a-vis the mess that surrounds us? Inequality, unjust societies, greed, corruption, the opioid epidemic, refugee crises, xenophobia, nationalism, racism, discrimination, climate change, sustainability issues, lack of empathy and compassion. I think the way we do this is we seek inspiration. We seek inspiration from whatever sources move you, which can be related to all of these varieties of the arts that I just spoke about, nature. But seeking inspiration is hugely important, I think, in meaning making. We keep learning. We recognize that we never know enough. We always need to know more. We always need to take in more. We need to appeal always to our better angels. We need to love. We need to laugh. And we need to infiltrate relevant power structures to affect societal change. That's, I think, a particularly important message for this group. Don't just preach to the choir. Infiltrate these other structures that are dysfunctional and are not serving all segments of society well. And that takes courage. Have courage and act. So when I look at this list, I think, well, this is what good humanists do every day. So let me just wish that we will all be able to keep doing this. Thank you.